I want to welcome everyone who's come today. I see that one of your grandsons is here as well. My name is Dennis Cooley. I am the director of the Northern Plains Ethics Institute at NDSU. That's the stuff on the sides here. We promote democratic participation in ethical and social issues affecting the Northern Plains and beyond. Perfect timing. Professor Dr. Barrett was in the area and he agreed to do a talk for us on Russia and Ukraine. Dr. Roby C. Barrett is a fellow of the Middle East and North Africa Forum at Cambridge University and a scholar with the Middle East Institute, Washington, D.C. Author of The Greater Middle East and the Cold War, U.S. Foreign Policy under Eisenhower and Kennedy, 1958 through 1963. Dr. Barrett is recognized for his expertise, experience, and publication on the Middle East. In fact, he's often hired by various organizations exactly on these issues. Secondly, his expertise focuses on Russia, the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and arms development. Originally trained as a Russian and Soviet expert during the Cold War, he served as an intelligence analyst in the Eastern European intelligence branch of the US government, where his writing was published in the Presidential Daily Brief. So that's what the president gets each day. Later, he worked on intelligence collection issues related to Soviet weapons development and proliferation. He's an expert on Soviet and Russian relations in the Middle East. In a 2016 National Intelligence Office exercise on Russian operations and goals in the Middle East, he served as the combined intelligence team leader on the Persian Gulf. As corporate vice president for special programs of Science Applications International, he did extensive work on U.S. strategic and nuclear issues related to the Soviet Union, including the Strategic Defense Initiative Star Wars and nuclear issues. A recipient of the Goddard Graduate Fellowship at Baylor University, Dr. Baylor studied Russian history, focusing on messianic ideas inherent in Russian Orthodox theology and the relationship to the Soviet-Russian exceptionalist self-imaging is detailed in his work. A historiographical. Their study of Nicholas Zernov is his work that he got for his master's.
Yeah.
He received a Scottish Rites Graduate Fellowship for expanded studies and research in Soviet and Eastern European political science. Dr. Barrett was awarded the Rotary International Graduate Fellowship for study at the Institute for Eastern European and Soviet Studies at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. He was awarded a second Scottish Rite Fellowship for study and research at Oxford University in Russian history. In addition, he received a scholarship for Russian language study at Dolmetscher Institute, Munich, which I probably killed, Germany. Subsequently, Dr. Barrett graduated from the two-year Middle East Studies and Arabic Language program at the Foreign Service Institute, Washington, D.C., and Tunis, Tunisia, and holds a PhD in Middle Eastern and South Asian history from the University of Texas at Austin, an MA in Russian history from Baylor University, and an MA in political science, focusing on Eastern European politics. And by the way, that's the short version of his CV. So let's welcome our speaker. Just grab a seat.
Okay, I'm warning you that this is a fire hose, okay? And so if you've got some question you want to bring up afterwards, that's great. I'll stay as long as you'll stay and ask questions. We can talk about this. I've been doing this last count for almost 45 years. And so, and dealing with Soviet-Russian affairs almost 45 years and Middle East, okay? So let's get started here. I gave a briefing in 2017 at USSOCOM, and I've taken some excerpts from it, and I'm not, the only thing I have reformatted a little bit, but I didn't change anything. The title, Existential Strategic Threats versus Security Challenges. Remember, we were in the middle of Afghanistan. We'd just come out of the Iraq thing. We had all sorts of issues. Here's what I said. For the U.S., the shock of 9/11 drove policies that inflated security and regional tactical challenges to the status of strategic threats. In other words, Al-Qaeda was a big-time threat, but it wasn't a strategic threat. Okay. The reaction to 9/11 brought policies that contributed significantly to the current situation in the Greater Levant. And what I was talking about there with the rise of ISIS, the kind of tactical issues that we were dealing with. Now, if you're one of the guys, one of the special forces guys out there that's getting shot at in eastern Syria, it's got a really straight out interest that for your own well-being. But the real issue was always China and Russia. The real issue from a strategic point of view was always China and Russia. And then we've got regional security challenges must be viewed in the context of global strategic interest. Now, problems in the Middle East because of oil can always turn into something strategic. We'll talk about that a little later. But this was kind of the introductory thing. And then I said, how do you define it? Concrete existential interest or strategic threat to the U.S. How do you decide that? First question you ask, can intelligence, policing, and special operations deal with it? Because if they can, it's probably not an immediate existential threat. Globally, what are the critical strategic interests of the U.S.? Terrorism tends to be, and you notice I put merely in quotes, tends to be a security and domestic politics issue. And what I mean by that is terrorism is a security issue, and how do you find the guys? How do you kill them before they kill you is what it amounts to. Domestic political issue, the reason it gets elevated is because if you knock down two buildings in New York, everybody goes crazy and it becomes a critical domestic political issue that whoever the powers that be have to deal with, whether or not that's actually a strategic threat. In other words, two buildings, and this sounds harsh, but think about it. In the context of our interest, two buildings being knocked down in New York, we recovered from it. Okay, it's not something that's going to bring you down. Somebody that's really trying to undermine you across the board in all your relationships and something and put you at a disadvantage strategically so you can't respond to them, that's something different. Can intelligence, I'm going to say it one more time, can intelligence, policing, and special operations deal with it, or is it a larger issue? Okay, now let's talk about a hierarchy of interests. I've got a map of Saudi Arabia and Iran and the Persian Gulf, one of China, one of China, South China Sea, and one of, Europe, including European USSR or Russia. Doesn't make any difference, same number. High bar for real strategic interests. China, Russia, and potentially oil, depending on what's going on. Do Iran and North Korea even make the cut? Is it terrorism, or are they really a strategic threat? You can imagine a scenario in which they become a strategic threat, but as they sit right now, it's something to be monitored and a real security problem, as opposed to a real security threat. How does a regional threat become a strategic threat? Okay, 1990, Saddam Iraq moved from a regional problem to a strategic threat. Why? Because they endangered the whole Gulf. The entire Gulf, all of the oil resources of the Gulf under control of somebody like Saddam Hussein, that's a strategic threat to the economy of the West. 2022 invasion of Ukraine, it's become a strategic gift from Mr. Putin to us. But at the same time, it's a threat. It's a real threat because unchecked, I can guarantee you he would have gambled, he would have began gambling on something else. It would have been the Baltic. It would have been Poland. It would have been Finland. You can just go down the list. I'm reminded of what somebody once said, and this is a question we have to ask. Is Russia Guatemala with nuclear weapons? That quote comes from 15 years ago when in a briefing in a conference room at the State Department that I was participating in, when one of the Eastern European guys, it was a great quote. He said, look, we're dealing with Guatemala with nuclear weapons here, unstable Guatemala. But we got to decide what let's talk about China briefly in this context. That's right. Rapid economic expansion, unparalleled, but it's brought with it distortions in the economy and threat to its own stability. In other words, we need to be looking at China really hard as a competitor, as a strategic threat, probably not an existential threat at this point, but we also need to be looking hard at what the weaknesses are, what the problems are, et cetera, et cetera. And right now, there's a whole series of things on the distortions in the Chinese economy. And Xi, the leader, is trying to become the emperor. And he's effectively done so. And when you have one guy with nobody that can countermand or make him rethink what he's doing, we've already seen what happens in the Ukraine, right? Expanded military capability. Right now, they're digging 500 or 1,000 new holes for ICBM because they want leverage. They think it gives them leverage. There is a total obsession with control. Rising radical nationalism, coupled with a sense of growing power and confidence and rising arrogance. We are training Chinese intelligence officers in American universities right now. And I'm not talking off the top of my head like some idiot right-wing nut on Fox, okay? I can name you people and places where it's happening. And one thing that uniformly happens, the Americans involved in the teaching programs, they're hoping it teaches the Chinese a little more open view of what's possible and what's not. But they're really surprised at how radically nationalistic the Chinese they're dealing with are. They can't see anything beyond Taiwan or whatever the next buzzword is. Well, and then short of cataclysm in China, which is a real possibility, Chinese power and influence could challenge that of the United States and Western Europe combined in coming decades. I don't think it will, but there's that possibility, and we have to monitor it. We are not in a position in the United States or North America, include Canada, whatever you want to, without our Western allies, to really be the dominant global force that we need to be. Those alliances are critical. We need to have our own capabilities, but we also need to link arms with our allies because we're much, much stronger all together than we are apart. All right, now I'm going to talk about Putin's strategic gift. This right here is the first real Russian state, Kievan Rus. And it's a Middle Ages state. It was wiped out by the Mongols, but really identity in Russia. And this shows the migration of Orthodoxy up into Kievan Rus. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit, the theory of the third Rome. This delineates Russia's expansion between 1461 and 1796. And so all of this down here in Central Asia happened in the 19th century. But it'll give you an idea of it had to keep expanding because of the nature and fundamental problematic nature of the way the state was formed. So it's been an empire since day one. If we just want to look at the last 500 years or so, 600 years. And here's Russia today. Truncated, part of it taken away. These states, which were part of the Soviet Union, now on their own, still under a Soviet umbrella, kind of under the old Soviet umbrella in something they call the Russian security thing, but it's actually still Russia trying to figure out in its reduced state how it recreates the Soviet Union. Vladimir Putin says the biggest disaster in the history of the modern world was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it was nothing but an empire that supported its minorities. when those German divisions were stopped in front of Moscow in 1941, those weren't Russian ethnic Russian troops that stopped it. Those were Mongolian troops brought all the way from the east. So Russia has always expanded, always carried out its attempts at expansion on the backs to a large degree of the minorities. To some extent, always the Russians themselves, but the minorities have always been the backbone because really in large areas of this, there's nothing there. War in the Ukraine is an inconceivable blunder on the part of Putin. I said almost. Now, here's why almost. Authoritarianism, expansionism, ethnocentric racism, fixtures of Russian history. And here's what I'm going to give you. You know, Monday Night Football, when they do the Mad Minute of all of the highlights, you know, of the day before, this is your Mad Minute of Russian history. And I've just picked some things. Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, second of the Rurik. His Oprichniki, he used those guys to enforce. They were like terrorism. They were like his security force, his intelligence force, and he used them to cow any of the opponents. It's the beginning of what we call the securitization of the state. Okay, they would function directly to the czar. They intimidated anybody that might disagree with him, object to him, or revolt against him. In desperate need of an heir, poor old Ivan loses his temper, picks up his scepter, and whacks his only son in the head with it and kills him. I mean, how self-destructive can you freaking get? Okay? But it's totally irrational. It's totally off. And part of it is, I really believe, you know, you can say it's the individual, you can say it's personality, you can say it's this. I think part of it is there's an awful lot of pressure when you're a despot and you're trying to do it. And you begin to think that you yourself are kind of infallible and that other people don't really count. And if they disagree with you, then they're not loyal. And I can only imagine what happened here. What it brought is something called a time of trouble, a period of 15 years when Russia was in total chaos. Out of that, a guy named Michael Romanov emerges as the ruler. And who do you think Putin compares himself to? Michael Romanov, first Romanov czar. He's the guy that ended the time of troubles. Putin in the 1990s, think about it. So in his own mind, he can't separate the two. He sees himself as the embodiment of it. Then you get to Alexis I, Michael's son, and you talk about the Roscoe. In other words, to control Russia, and there's always been this dichotomy, he wants to westernize, and he appoints his own patriarch. And he tries to turn the religion into a function of the state, an ideological function of the state. This idea of Holy Mother Russia. The result is they have old believers that say, this isn't really it. We have our own religion. These people are trying to usurp it, you know, et cetera, et cetera. There's how Alexis dealt with it. Okay? I mean, there's a really good article called Old Believers in a New Religion by Michael Chernyavsky, published back in the 60s, but still one of the best things on the Roskol, which literally means split in Russian. And then we get to Peter the Great. And Putin just compared himself to Peter the Great not too long ago. In other words, the conquest of the North and the conquest of the Ukraine, he said they were the same, just like Peter the Great. And you have old Peter at almost 7 feet tall wandering around Holland in disguise, because he's trying to understand. He realized Russia is really backward technologically, et cetera, et cetera. And he's trying to figure out how you modernize. But he's got the boyars, the old traditionalists, cuts their beards, cuts their hair. The ones he doesn't like when they revolted against him, he himself allegedly stood on Red Square with an axe and chopped some heads off himself. Okay. And so it's back to this authoritarianism and the split that you have in society. It's almost schizophrenic. It is schizophrenic. And look at this. This is on a street in Moscow. You see the security police walking by? There's old Peter. Because that's how Putin wants to be seen. Then you have Catherine the Great. She wasn't even Russian. She was a German princess, killed her Russian husband, ruled through his cronies. And the Potemkin, and Count Potemkin here. So when Catherine was a product of the Enlightenment, okay? And so she thought there was this new world out there. So she was told, listen, see if this sounds familiar. She was told by Potemkin, and she was told by other people around her, that everything was great. It was looking good, you know, we were doing this. Well, she decided to take a tour of the country, and he's like, oh my God, it's a mess out there. And so what they did is created Potemkin villages. And here is an illustration of it. Everybody's out in their nice clothes, the carriage is going by, and around the corner you have the starving. And they literally would move the villages from place to place so that every time she showed up, they could tell her what she wanted to hear, not what reality. Sound familiar? All right. Leads to one of the biggest revolts that almost overthrows the Pugachev revolt that almost overthrows the Romanov regime. Pugachev's an interesting character because who did he tell everybody he actually was? He told them that he'd come to save the peasantry from the aristocracy, those starving people. And he told them he was actually the murdered husband of Catherine. Catherine had her husband murdered, you know, he was actually the czar and she became Tsarina. That's what he did. But Pugachev almost undid the regime. Then we get old Alexander II. This is mid-19th century. He says he got to reform. All these people are serfs, virtually tied to land, virtually slaves. Not quite, but virtually. And so he's got to reform. So Russia's so backward, we got to figure out some way about this. Russia's just lost the Crimean War of 1854 to 1856. And so Alexander comes up and says, well, we'll end serfdom. But if you got a serf towing a barge on the Volga and you free the serf, he's still got to tow the barge on the Volga. The only difference is the landowner's not responsible in any way for his upkeep. Okay, so this is the nature of it. And so the anarchists, these Western ideas are creeping in. The anarchists decide they've had enough of Alexander II, and they blow him up in front of the Winter Palace and kill him. All right. And he's replaced by Alexander III, who is a total authoritarian whatever, and Nicholas II, who was a total authoritarian whatever, but he was weak compared to Alexander III. And we know what happened to Nicholas, right? But Nicholas is worried. He knows he's kind of weak. His wife is a German princess who tells him what to do. You got to be really careful if your spouse on either side has German in them. Okay, they will tell you what to do. And so he decides that they need a quick, glorious war over these inferior people out in the Far East, you know, the Japanese. And so he sends his Atlantic squad. First of all, the Japanese get lucky and wipe out his Asian squadron. And so he sends his Atlantic squadron around, and then he had moved in, he tries to wipe them out. And guess what happens? Every bit of the Russian fleet is at the bottom of the ocean after Admiral Togo gets through with it. totally underestimated because of racism and other things, his opponent. All right. 1905, revolution in Russia. They say, we've had enough of this. We want reforms. We want a Duma. We want a real Duma that has power. We want democracy. Holds together for about 2 years, and then the Shah, same thing happened in Iran, by the way. They had the Iranians had a 1905 revolution that mirrored this because the Russians were in control in Tehran. And so it mirrored it. But the Tsar clawed back power, but he had to give it up. 2005 almost did, 1905 almost did, the Romanovs did. The revolution in 1917 really doesn't end. And what emerges is first Lenin, who really fought the Civil War part of it, and then Stalin. You see this right here? Everybody was extolling how wonderful it was and what a great leader Stalin was. Remember the praise for Putin? What a great leader he was and all this other stuff. While in reality, when you went out into the Ukraine, he was starving millions to death to sell the wheat on the open market to get capital to be able to invest in heavy industry to turn the Soviet Union into a military power. 4 million Ukrainians dead. You think the Ukrainians want to be ruled by the Russians? You don't forget something like that. When in World War II, they tried to deny Polish nationality because the Poles really had no state until after at the end of World War I. And the first thing that the Germans did is they came in from one side, made a deal with the Russians who came in from the other. The Germans, we all know, slaughtered Jews, intelligentsia, and everything else. And then in 1943, the Germans in the invasion discovered this, because in attempting to eradicate an identity that they did not want, the Russians and the Soviets slaughtered, nobody knows how many, at least 10 or 15,000. Teachers, lawyers, doctors, military officers, everybody you could. And this is what they dug up. Now, if you're the Germans and you invite the Red Cross in to investigate something, given the German track record, right, in World War II, then obviously something happened that you're pretty sure you didn't do, and it'll be obvious who did it, the other guys, right? And that's what happened. Then in 1944, with the Polish Home Army in full revolt against the Germans, the Russians stopped on the other side of the river and waited until the Germans wiped the Polish Home Army out because they did not want the competition. They wanted to create a state that was totally subservient to them. So what's Putin doing now? Right? What is he trying to do? Very Russian. This comes from that briefing 2017 with SOCOM. Russian Instability and Decline was the title. Nuclear threat, saber rattling. Russia without the Ukraine and the Baltics is a regional power. With them, it's an empire. We're talking 2017 with me standing up in front of a couple of hundred people at SOCOM. Sophisticated use of soft to undermine its neighbor. We're talking about the Baltics, we're talking about Crimea, we're talking about the whole thing in the Donbass back in 2014. Soft is Special Operations Forces. Russia cannot escape its past. There's a new nomenclature, meaning that's the old head of the Soviet state and the officials. But what we're really talking about here is the nomenclature, or the new people around Putin. They're presiding over increased defense spending, a failed economy, declining population, little option but to expand in territory or decline further. This is what's driving Putin. It's an empire. It has to expand or it dies. Okay? Give you an example. There was a visiting Russian professor here. Must have been 6, 8 years ago. And he and I were talking. And I said, so what are you doing tomorrow? And he said, oh, I've got back-to-back doctor's appointments. The reason was that the medical system was so decrepit, this is 2015, 16, was so decrepit and so bad that where he was at a university, he couldn't get care. And so basically he had a 6-month Fulbright here or something. And he was using as much time as possible to go to the dentist to get his teeth fixed, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this place could have been a show place with all that oil money. But he didn't care. All he cared about was this vision of what he thought he ought to be and what Russia ought to be, not about what he could do. He could have made him a show place. We're going to talk about Russian messianism. Third Rome. First Rome falls 454, something like that. Second Rome falls. What is the second Rome? Constantinople. Falls 1453 to the Turks. And so the Russians developed this idea of the third Rome, which was Moscow is the only surviving true religion. The rest of them, the Catholics, they fell away from God, and so they were punished. The Orthodox, same thing happened. Now, Russia's the third Rome. And so it's this idea of Russia, special mission. It's a self-conceived moral superiority of Russian autocracy and a realization that they have to somehow explain their lack of modernization and social development. It's a set of surreal explanations for inferiority vis-a-vis the West. You can't get your teeth fixed, right? Isolated ruler believed that diplomacy was simply a question of combining force with personal charm. Russia could acquire whatever it wanted merely by the threat of war. What did he think with the Ukrainians? He thought they were going to throw up their hands and surrender. Ruler did not recognize the dangers in the sense of his own infallibility. Opponents were declared insane and shipped off to insane asylum. Underlings lived in constant fear of what the ruler was going to do or the next. Advisors ingratiated themselves by encouraging wilder expansionist dreams and fantasy view of reality to further inflate the ruler's ego. You want to tell Putin that he's an idiot? Okay. It is a Potemkin, remember the village? It is a Potemkin reality, a facade. Saint-Gobain told him what he wanted to hear. They made up crazy poems about what Russia's role was, and this is literally a poem that one of the followers of the put together. Seven inland seas, 7 mighty rivers, Nile to Neva, China, Volga to Euphrates, Ganges to Danube, such as our empire to be. Okay, now here's the kicker. Was it Putin? No, but he believed it all. Was it Alexander II? No, but he believed it all. This was frickin' Nicholas I before the Crimean War in 1854. It is an endemic thing in the mind of Russian rulers. And I can even take it back much further than that, but I ran out of space. Are you believing this? I mean, you look at the quotes and you say, good grief, this could be Vladimir Putin. Okay, Putin's manifesto. The amateur historian writes an article. Of course, he didn't write it. He had somebody else on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. He basically says that there's no such thing as a Ukrainian identity, history, even though Ukraine was the original Russian state, if you will, basically arguing that Ukrainian and Belarusian identity were inverted creations of Lenin's decision to create 3 equal states, Russia, the Ukraine, and Belarus. You see, Ukraine, since the formation of the Soviet Union, has had a seat at the United Nations as an independent state. Okay, pro-Russian media hailed the article as Putin's ultimatum. Either the Ukrainians comply or face the consequence. By the fall of 2021, US intelligence is convinced that Russia is going to invade. And I'm talking about 6 months before. These guys just say it's going to happen. What are all the Europeans saying? Oh no, he's just going to do this. If he does anything, he'll do this. I mean, everybody in the world, you know why? Because they didn't want to believe that something like what has happened could happen. They didn't understand who they were dealing with. For God's sake, a former German prime minister or chancellor is on the Putin's and Gazprom's payroll. Russia invades the Ukraine. Surprise, surprise to everybody. Okay, now this is the quote of the century. We called him and said, listen, we got to get you out of there. It's, you know, I need ammunition, not a ride. I mean, whether that quote really happened or not, we all think it did. It should have happened, okay? This is what was reported, so I'm putting it up there. But this is, if anybody believes that's not his attitude, think again. And I like his dress uniform too. So I'm sure he washed it. So this is the boys in Alabama, the Red Zones. They make javelins, roll tide, ammunition dump, wreck T-80, drones. Russia assumed the Ukraine would collapse rapidly. U.S. assumed initial Russian victory protracted guerrilla war. We had really poor intel on the actual workings inside the Russian military. I mean, we knew a whole lot about their equipment and capabilities in theory, what was being published. But as far as really understanding what was broken, we didn't really have a really good grasp on it. And we looked at the disparity in size, and it's an honest mistake. They said, well, this is going to be all over with, you know, and we're going to have to set up and fight a guerrilla war. And that's why we ship the kinds of stuff that we ship to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians didn't get either one of these memos. You see what I'm saying? So you got these 2 memos, right? But they didn't get either one of them. And during the first month, we are stunned. We are stunned by these people really fighting for themselves. People with no training at all, you give them a 30-minute brief on a javelin, and yeah, I can take out a Russian tank or a fuel truck or whatever else. And they just clean their clock, completely defeat the drive on Kiev. They outfight, outmaneuver, outsmart, and crush the Russians in front of Kiev. And these are the best units in the Russian army. These are VDV, these are special Spetsnaz, these are special forces. They get creamed. It becomes apparent, really, within the first 60 to 90 days that Russia can't really win what they conceived of doing. They can't do it. And the idea begins to go. Talk about strategic benefit. Potential for a strategic Russian disaster. Most important results of Putin's war. Europeans recognize that Russia can't be a rational partner, not in security, not in economics, not in social stability, and Russia is now disconnected from the global economy that matters. They are a gas station, as somebody put it, masquerading as a country. Okay. NATO reinvigorated, expanded, rearming. I mean, who would have ever thought? Finland and Sweden, and I want to tell you something. The Finns know how to kill Russians. 1940, they killed 200,000 of them, and the Russians never conquered Britain. The Germans have awakened from their slumber. And Poland and the Baltics now become the critical element in what we're doing vis-a-vis NATO and Europe. Russian military turns out to be a hollow threat. Now, when I say that, there's still a nuclear power, but the efficacy of nuclear weapons, and we'll talk about this a little bit, the efficacy of nuclear weapons, I mean, you're going to get wiped out. At a minimum, any kind of use of nuclear weapons means that we will destroy the Russian army in Ukraine, no matter what else happens in Ukraine and Crimea. And we're totally capable of doing it, probably without using nukes. Compromised Russian technology. We'll talk about that a little more. Russian leadership and the former USSR is undermined. All of these other powers, all of these other states that had kowtowed to Russia now don't listen to them at all. They wouldn't support them. Kazakhstan, you go down this list, they wanted troops. They said, no, we're not giving you. Okay? Russian decline, the decline that was hidden behind Putin's bluster is now on global display. And the shrinking population, the thing that he always said scared him to death was the lack of population growth to be able to support this empire. How many people have left just since mobilization? And over the whole course of the war, maybe 1 million. And what are they? They're the tech savvy, the young, the educated, the whatever. They're going to be left with a bunch of old geezers like me, okay? And they're going to be in they already are, in really terrible shape, no matter what else happens. And the Chechens, you've got Chechen leadership down on the Kremlin, but remember that they conquered and killed thousands and thousands in all these places that Putin did. And there's a bunch of people that don't forget. Here's the other thing that's important for the military. You know, we've done a pretty good time. I mean, I watched what the 101st Airborne did. I was with them in Iraq. And we've done a pretty good job. But we fought these side wars where it wasn't a near peer opponent, okay? So you didn't have to worry about the other guy lining up 100 heavy artillery pieces and blasting the hell out of it, okay? So it's hard to prepare for the unknown if you don't know what it's like. You haven't seen it. You get a little glimpses of it here and there. Suddenly, Ukraine has turned into this vast laboratory where we can now look at it and say, where ought we to be spending money? What ought we to be doing? How should we be training officers and whatever? How should we be thinking about this in the future? And what about civilian mobilization? I mean, in the beginning, really, there were a lot of civilians that were 2-week-old volunteers, 2-week volunteers that were knocking out Russian tanks in front of Kiev. Okay, and so we and the military are learning some really important things out of this, and it's a heck of a test bed for weapon systems. We really know now that the Russians don't have anything that can stand up to a javelin, right? And a whole list of other things. And here's the other thing I think is really important. There is a chance here to undermine the efficacy of nuclear proliferation. You got every nutcase country in the world out there trying to build a nuke because they think this gives you some kind of guarantee. Nukes have very little battlefield utility. Very little battlefield utility. I'm not saying they're totally worthless, but by and large, pretty worthless. And to use them means total annihilation. So you lose in one way, it's ineffective, and everybody gets down on you, and the other way, you're done. Okay. If we can prove nuclear blackmail is ineffective, we may be able to blunt proliferation. Stop and think about it. You can go to the Iranians and say, what good is that nuke gun? Really? You want a nuclear program that's going to cause us, the Israelis, everybody else, to decide something has to be done about you. And it's almost of value. I mean, it may be a prestige thing. Look at poor old Kim in North Korea, trying to get everybody's attention, shooting missiles across Japan, and everybody's like, "Ah, now we got bigger fish to fry." Okay, there's something to be gained here potentially on the diplomatic front and on and kind of the global security front. Can we have a mistake? Yeah, could be. But you know what? We lived with that, or I did. Most of you didn't. Most of you were born way up that, but I lived with that almost my whole life. And one thing I think that the Soviet leadership, as opposed to Putin, and the US leadership understood was that you had to figure out a way to deal with your differences, because if you ever push the button on this, the results weren't going to be good for anyone. And for Russia in particular, where the concentration of population and capability is in really, really small areas, we're 300 million people. We would take horrible casualties. They would cease to exist as a state, or maybe even as a people. And so there's an argument to be made here that this can be used to everyone's benefit. All right, global income. I've already talked about this. I actually told the people at the German Council on Foreign Relations in 2015, I was giving a briefing, we got off on the energy topic. I said, you guys, this is really not too bright. You are putting yourself in a position to be blackmailed by Putin, and he will do it at the drop of a hat. So we need to help the Europeans all we can. But we also need to remind them that this is self-inflicted. They are sitting on enough shale gas to keep them running for 20 years, but they're afraid of earthquakes, which I get it. It's a bad environmental thing. It's, there's all sorts of issues. But they are perfectly willing to live off of our shale gas as we try to help them out. They need to revisit their entire energy issue. All of northern France, Belgium, lots of Germany, there's shale gas everywhere. Just need to put a bunch of West Texas frackers out there, and they can straighten this out. German military come very short-sighted, couldn't even fly their planes, couldn't defend Germany, much less. That's all changed. It'll be interesting to see how they handle this. And I make this point, Merkel was timid in dealing with Putin, and Schroeder was on his payroll. Sweden and Finland is a huge deal. Huge deal. I mean, this is a diplomatic security victory beyond anything you could imagine coming out of it. And it's the polar opposite of what Putin said he was up to. Those Finnish, Swedes too. Poland, the most anti-Russian state in Europe, has now become critically important and will get massive US aid and standardization with NATO, okay? Forget the old MiG-29s and everything else. They're gonna get our kit. CSTO, CSTO, which is Russia's NATO, whatever, counterpart, it's falling apart. They don't want any part of this thing in the Ukraine. He's not getting any mutual support. And here's a good example. Armenia, Azerbaijan in a war, the Russians sent in peacekeepers, blah, blah, blah. Well, as soon as the Russia gets tied down, the war breaks out again. Armenia asks for Russian troops. Russia says no, okay? They need them somewhere else, okay? So what are you gonna, I think this is gonna happen all over Central Asia. Other thing is, China no longer views Russia as a peer state. They see Russia as a quasi-colony that supplies gas. Do you want that technology, that Russian technology? Not without the German, American, Japanese chips and motors and everything in it. You don't want any of that. And it's got, it also has Taiwan implications. China's got to think twice. Things aren't as easy as they sometimes appear. I think at a minimum, whatever this does, Ukraine's going to emerge with hard Western security guarantees. It may not be NATO, but they're going to get hard security. And they are standardizing on the NATO standard. If the 155s going to them are far more important than most people realize, because they need to get rid of all that Russian 122 and 152 stuff and start getting standardized stuff with us that ties them to us. Russia, second best military in the world, actually second best military in the Ukraine. FMF, and this is something important, guys. We build an F-35. The cost of an F-35, and I'm not a huge fan of it, but we got it, okay? Cost of an F-35, $129 million. I mean, outrageous. But once you start selling it, then suddenly the unit cost goes down. So they're claiming, of course, they're not telling the truth, but they're claiming that the cost now is in the $35 to $40 million range, whatever on that. As they're massaging the numbers, but it really has dropped significantly. Why? Because we're selling it to the Germans, the Finns, everybody, and the bigger you make the production line, the less per unit cost is, okay? Russia has been so poor in what they've done that that's the way they finance their stuff. India runs all Russian equipment. They sell jets to the Europeans. They do this, they do that. But why would you buy second-tier equipment that's getting blown up right and left? And why would you buy from somebody that can't even supply his own troops without Western technology in it? And depend on him to have a pipeline to supply you? This is going to be really long-term damaging to capability. Russian doctrine never envisioned Putin's gamble. The core, they use core units, training units, they're gutted. It was always supposed to be reserves called up, and he couldn't do it, he thought, for political reasons. And now once it's I think it's probably too late, he's called up reserves. The ones that haven't headed for Kazakhstan. Okay, shocking exposure. Look at this. So the Russians have this Iskander missile, we know that. But they shoot one that doesn't go off, and so we get to look at it. What we didn't know is it had these decoy drones in it and everything. They have left their crown jewels of their military technology on the battlefield. EW stuff, electronic warfare stuff, everything you can, radars, everything you can think of. And the really prized stuff, somebody goes out and looks at it and says, ooh, well, I think maybe that ought to go to Wright-Patterson. That ought to go out, that's on a fall. And they call up and they say, well, we got this truck that's going to show up and it's going to be put on a Globemaster, and you guys just, when you get it there, let's tell us how this thing works. I mean, it is a windfall for somebody that spent part of his career trying to steal an Mi-25 back in the dark ages. You just can't imagine what a big deal this is from a technology standpoint. Big morale problem. We don't need to talk about that, but I love the Ukrainian cyber warfare 1-800-I-want-to-live line. Have y'all been watching any of this? The Ukrainians have created a 1-800-I-want-to-live line for Russian draftees and conscripts, et cetera. And it explains to them how they can surrender rather than have the Ukrainians kill them when they show up. And I mean, no matter how well it works or it doesn't work, I mean, what a piece of cyber warfare. And in the information warfare, the Russians have totally lost. Russian intelligence has been a colossal disaster. FSB, SVR, the foreign intelligence units, TRU, military, and then the idiots around Putin. Total disaster. All right, fundamentals. No matter what happens here, Russia's always going to be Russian. I don't care if it's 40 years from now. It would be so colossal to be able to change and actually be a partner with everybody in the rest of the world. I don't see that happening. Autocratic, backward, paranoid, resenting the West. They're stealing washing machines in the Ukraine. Children's toys, because they aren't available in Russia to these people. Okay? For us, economic prosperity is inextricably connected to political will and military capability. You can't protect what you have unless you're willing to fight for it at some point. Period. The Germans are learning this the hard way. Even with our differences, we're more than a match for the Chinese as long as us in Europe. But we need to maintain our focus and cooperation. It's not just NATO, it's bilateral agreements with Japan, with Australia, with New Zealand. Leadership is critical. Putin destroyed Russia by misunderstanding his opponent. Now, I don't give a damn what you think about Biden, okay? But Biden is an old cold warrior, and he's known Putin for 20 years. He knows who he's dealing with, okay, and what he thinks he has to do. And so far, not bad, not bad. Burns was the ambassador, former State Department officer, head of CIA, was the former ambassador to Russia, had dealt one-on-one with Putin forever. Putin failed to put that kind of stuff into his calculations that they knew him. Okay? Superior military technology is critical. But here's the thing we've learned. You cannot have too many shells, too many rockets, too many missiles. And you got to have the industrial capability to do it. We got one little plant in Arkansas putting out all the hardware for is it Javelin or the HIMARS. You got to have more than that. We need a robust industrial pipeline. 155 shells aren't sexy, but you need tons and tons of them. I mean, we got 9 million. We handed out about 1 million. We really should have had 25 million. If you want to see an interesting story of this, go to David Lloyd George and look at him taking over the armaments industry in Britain in World War I. They ran out of shells. They thought they had enough shells for anything. And they fully mobilized it. And he is really an interesting character in what he had to do that. There have been studies. Somebody said, okay, we've only got a little more than 100 F-22s. And I said, and challenging the Chinese Air Force, they could shoot them all down. The problem is they would run out of missiles. In other words, the capability. You can't have that. We have to rethink that. Ukrainian competence, Putin's blunder allows the West to accomplish a strategic goal with indirect intervention. They really are fighting our war. All these shells and everything else were intended for us to confront the Russians. If we can get the Ukrainians to do it for us and build up the industrial thing behind it, it moves the center of gravity further east, and we get where we want without direct intervention to this point. And no matter when we intervene, the Russians are so crippled, if it were tomorrow, we would be in far better shape than we would have been 8 months ago. Likely path forward. Most of the Russian elites are beginning to see the war as lost. Putin is trapped between the Ukraine, the nationalists, and the realists. This is what all of this rocket fire and missile fire on Kiev is about. He's trying to save face because the nationalists are down on his case for being an incompetent boob, okay? And so he's doing all this to say, now, I did this. But I mean, okay, it's terrorism. You hit a playground, you hit this, you hit an apartment block, but it doesn't help you at all in the war. And you're not gonna break their will. We learned that. We bombed the Germans into nothing, and it didn't break their will. They fought to the bitter end. Desperation, nuclear threat, mobilization, terror bombing, all of that says I'm losing and I'm desperate. Mobilization. This may prove to be the straw that breaks Putin's back. You can't have 500 to 700,000 people leave the country in the H bracket. But we'll have to, Russia's weakened, consigned to decades of recovery. Increasing Western aid for the Ukraine, including longer range missiles. I expect them to get ATACMS any day. It would not surprise me if it were tomorrow. We'll see what happens. ATACMS is the 300-kilometer, the 200-mile version of the HIMARS. HIMARS is 50 miles, 200 miles, and it's a heck of a lot bigger missile. All right? Regardless, I don't care whether you end up using it and getting demolished, or you just rattle a saber all the time because you know you can't use it. Nuclear option has got to come out of this as overrated. All right, what should our policy be? Stay the course of Ukraine, rectify 2 decades of policy mistakes with Russia, and that is Bush, Obama, and certainly Trump. Okay, I mean, all three of those administrations, their views were problematic. We'll put it that way. Take advantage of Putin's gift. Do not succumb to nuclear blackmail in a world of proliferation. If you do, who's going to be next? Okay, Iran, North Korea. Use the Ukrainian war as a clinic for future warfare. That's the hardest thing to get if you're in the military, is to be able to see the future. And something like this gives you a real solid glimpse of it. It won't exactly replicate, but it gives you a real solid glimpse of what you're going to have. Strengthen ties with allies. I don't care whether it's NATO, Japan, the ANZUs. Cultivate new relationships. India's rethinking its dependence on Soviet hardware. There are Indian politicians attacking the government right now for their military Soviet. Southeast Asia, Central Asia as Russia's grips back, and prepare for some kind of Chinese challenge. Now, suggestion. Okay, Pirun has literally got the best collection of videos on YouTube anywhere. And I'll tell you, I mean, it's unbelievable on the war, on issues, on tactics, on technology. It's a bunch of Australians. I mean, who would have thought? They don't have anything else to do. Chase kangaroos? I mean, I don't know. Okay, but it is literally the best thing you can see anywhere. I caution you to look at the date of when the thing is put out. But they've just done a thing on mobilization. They've done a thing on FMF. Now, every time they put one out, I watch it because some things I disagree with, they were way conservative in the beginning. But for example, the issue of the Kiev campaign, well, we're just waiting for the other shoe to fall because Russia really hadn't committed itself. Well, these guys came out 3-4 months ago and said, nonsense. We've looked at it all. We've looked at all of the open sources. They've thrown everything they've got at it. All their elite troops, and they've been locked. Those are absolutely, they're usually about an hour long, but pay real close attention to what it is. And there's all kinds of stuff. There's one on German rearmament. They say the Germans are a bunch of bureaucrats and have a hell of a time overcoming it. Well, we are too, but we somehow overcome it. Okay. Fiona Hill. That's Trump's advisor on Russia, okay? She's a Brit turned American. You know, a lot of us at one time were Brits turned American. But she's a Brit turned American. Extremely smart. Got to a point where she couldn't stand the idiots around her and left the administration, but she was there for years. She says that Putin's been fighting World War III since he came to power, and we only just recently caught on. If you look at what he's been doing, okay? Trevor Royal, I just read this, and I'm telling you, the Crimean War, you know, it started over who had the keys to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, kind of. And it was because the Russian emperor had this crazy view of himself and his role in the Ottoman Empire, that he started this war that he thought everybody would back down from. Nicholas Brzezinski, really good guy. Russian Revolution, 1905 to 1921. Worth, Russia at War. It's kind of an old classic. Service, Last of the Tsars. And I just threw in Sergei Platonov, who is an old Russian historian, and he talks about the time of troubles. Now, there's a zillion more things, but for the war itself, there's a lot of crud out there on YouTube, okay? But for hard analysis and really thought through stuff, Pirun is really superior. That's it.
Thank you.
Yeah, anybody that needs to go, just feel free, but if you want to stay and ask questions and discuss, I'll be glad to. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you see as the Chinese weaknesses?
I'm sorry.
Can you say a little more about what you think are the weaknesses of China?
Well, you know, this is, yeah, I'm so glad my daughter's on here. My daughter is a Chinese historian, okay, and so I'm if she's here, I automatically have to be a little paranoid about what I say. So not exactly what it is. Here's the deal. China's problem has always been an elite with this massive poverty at the bottom. Massive. I mean, I don't care which dynasty you talk about. I don't care what happened. There's this fundamental weakness in society. And what's emerged is China, rather than investing internally, they've turned a lot of their economic investment, I mean, externally, to internal, that is other than corn farms up in North Dakota, so they can watch the drones over it. But there's been this internal attempt to bolster the economy. They've had this really high growth rate of 8%, but they've had to bolster it with this artificial housing and real estate market inside the thing, and it's collapsing. And so what's going to happen is you're going to see people falling out of the middle class that had made it before, and you see them becoming more and more authoritarian. And then all of a sudden you see us waking up. We're looking at Russia and saying the Russians couldn't fly a drone without a Japanese motor, an American chips, a German lift, a German controller, whatever else. I mean, all of their stuff has this heavy Western component. So we've cut off their chips. We've gone into a thing cutting off things. Now, it won't be universal, but it's going to really hurt us. And we're thinking about those things now. And so the only choice that I think she is going to have is to become more and more authoritarian. I mean, it's 1984 there. You can't walk outside without somebody taking a picture of you and following you around, et cetera, et cetera. And the minorities are going to become more and more restless, and you're going to find them less able to pay for their big grandiose project. And so at some point, and even if you look at the struggles within the Communist Party, one of the guys that was found guilty of corruption and eventually shot, really his transgression was that he harkened back to the old Maoist thing and said, what happened to the peasants and what happened to the workers? And all these rich people driving around in their cars in Beijing and Shanghai and Hong Kong and Guangzhou. What happened to all of this? And that's what they really fear, is this internal combustibility. Now, there is an argument that there was this new nationalism in China, that there was no such thing as that, the way it is now, prior to World War II. You were from Guangzhou, you were from Hong Kong, you were from Sichuan, you were from Fujian, okay? And so it was much more localized. Then the Japanese show up and lump them all together as Chinese and start indiscriminately killing, okay? And so they look around and say, well, I may not know exactly who I am, but I know who I'm not, okay, sort of thing. And so you've got this new realization of community that I think is probably a false realization, but I mean, those things take generations to work through. And so I think that what you're going to see, I don't think you're going to see a collapse. You could see an explosion. You could see G removed or whatever else. But what you're going to see is more and more instability. The danger in that is the way Putin has dealt with instability. He started a war every time he did. Okay, go invade Georgia. Let's go invade. Let's take the Crimea. You know, something to distract people. But the problems are so pervasive, and China is so big. It's going to be a lot harder. If you take the 1 point, what are they claiming? I saw a thing today that said they were really only 1.3 or 1.4 billion, but whatever their number is. And you look at this and you say, how many of these people are really benefiting from the current system? 20%, 30%? The rest of them are left behind in excruciating circumstances. That's exactly what has blown China apart every time. Want to read something really interesting? The Taiping Revolt. You got this guy that is reared partially by Baptist missionaries. That's a bad thing. I come from Waco. I was raised by the Baptist Taliban, so I can talk about it. Got a degree from Baylor. Okay, so. But you got this guy exposed, and he decides he's the younger brother of Jesus Christ and preaches this method of equality and whatever else. And darn near, without the intervention of the British, brings down the entire Chinese empire. And that's why they go nuts about something like Falun Gong and stuff like, because they know how fragile it is, the guys at the top. So I would say economic dislocation, just the disparity. That's why when we talk about disparity, I hate economic disparity here, because that's your first step towards having real problems. And I'm not talking about everybody equal. I'm talking about everybody has an opportunity, or is in a position to have an opportunity. And so this is something, and I think this is really it. And that nationalism thing, that's a really interesting article. I'm a really interesting view. So my daughter's really convinced of that. I mean, she's an expert on Chinese minorities in Southeast Asia and wherever. And if you look at how that worked, they all hark back until the Japanese. And then the Japanese didn't care whether you were Chinese, and they killed you. And so I think that's the danger, that it fractures, and this contract, the disparity just finally overwhelms you. Yeah.
So I've heard this quite a few times. If you could, one of the things that I've heard some folks say to finish this off is to have Putin assassinated. What do you think? And
Well,
I've heard that it would actually.
let me tell you what Zelensky. They asked Zelensky. He said, whatever happens here, Russia with Putin or without Putin, and Zelensky says, I don't care. You know why? Did you know that's my Mad Minute on Russian history? The next Russian that comes along is going to dream up something too. I mean, his great-great-great-grandfather, 3 times removed, was born in Podunk, Ukraine, and therefore it's a part of Russia, or something else. Do you see what I'm saying? And so to Zelensky, and there's some truth in this, it doesn't make any difference until there's something fundamental that changes within Russia, where they take all this massive wealth and focus it on their own people. In other words, they get serious about their Ferris wheel in Moscow, and they improve the roads. I mean, the Russian soldiers on the intercept are made. They've got roads that are paved, et cetera, because these people come from the boonies where there's nothing. That's really the way you secure yourself. How a guy could have been in such a strong position and do something so idiotic just goes to show you the fundamentally, he was in an incredibly strong position. And he was an idiot. Thank God. And so the question is, I think, killing Putin is something that the Russians have to make up their mind as to whether they want to do it. And there's an argument, Fedorov, they got her up, the crazy Chechen, okay? Well, you'd rather have Putin than the crazy Chechen, right? I mean, remember, Stalin was a Georgian. He wasn't a Russian. He spoke Russian with a lisp, literally with a Georgian accent. So like, they made fun of him, not out loud though. But Putin really surviving crippled, discredited, really might be the best thing to have happen. With everybody coming around and saying, we don't want to be embarrassed by all this, but you got a choice. We can shoot you between the eyes right now. This is the Russians. Or we can let you keep on as your little whatever up here. But we got to change what's going on here and you're no longer running the show. That'd be the smart thing to do. But we'll see. So I don't think it's fascinating. Now, in the realm of karmic justice, he should be drawn and quartered. That playground in Kiev, they'll just have a big execution and make it look like Robert, make it look like Braveheart or something, right? Okay, so I mean, seriously, of karmic justice, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about realistically. It'd be a whole lot better to have somebody who's been totally cowed and discredited, my view, as long as he no longer gets to make idiot decisions. There's a committee around him. That was the big, the USSR, at least he had a committee. You know, if you got too crazy like Khrushchev, somebody met you at the airport and said, you're no longer running things, so how are you going to react to that? And it wasn't simple. They were scared to death to challenge the guys that did it. Brezhnev and all of them. They were, Brezhnev like posted 3 guards outside of his room while they were plotting and scheming, against him. But Khrushchev said, I'm kind of tired. I'd like to go to my dacha and just retire and write my memoirs. I said, great idea. And so, I mean, yeah. You don't know what you get. Him discredited and put in a box, that's a different matter. Okay?
I have a question for you. So I know that the playing field could be changed if the Russians, for example, decided to use nukes, right? But if it isn't changed, if it goes on as it is there any way to figure out how long this will last?
I don't think, well, that's why I said go read that book on the Crimean War. Took 3 years. Took 3 years. And I don't think the nukes would change it. The nukes might bring everything to it. And the nukes bring everything to it.
Yeah, because then all the other.
Yeah, in about the next 35 minutes. Okay. Right. And but honestly, if you look at it, let's look at the mobilization. So what, you mobilize 300,000 or 400,000 troops. Now, what they're doing right now is they're just hanging on to anything they can hang on to. And the big thing is Kherson in that area right now. Well, if you get in another 150,000 troops, but look, all the supply and logistics lines are cut. Their logistics are terrible. They can't run anything, can't run a war. And you'll put another 150,000 mouths there to feed. Okay? I freaking hope they do. Because at some point, those guys are going to stand up, put their hands up and walk to the west and go to say, 3 prison camps, 3 meals a day, clean clothes, and whatever sounds pretty good to me compared to dying in this hole. So I think it's too late. And I also think the Ukrainians have destroyed an enormous amount of Russian equipment and capability. An enormous amount. They're down to pulling T-62s from 1967, 8 out of storage and trying to figure out a way to put them back together to send them to the front. What are you going to equip them with? And winter war is coming. Everybody says winter's going to slow down. I got a bet with. I bet the Ukes are already prepping up for the winter war. And I bet they're going to have warm clothes on and they're going to have muckalucks and they're going to have all this. And the Russians are going to be down there with their little yoga pad that they had to buy themselves trying to wrap up in a bunch of tree branches and stay warm, it's gonna look like Hitler's army or Napoleon's army in front of Moscow. And those guys are gonna be all over. And I'll lay you something else. I'll bet there are key Ukrainian officers right now in Finland and Sweden. And they're getting briefed on how you fight a war. And the frickin' Finns know how to do it. So my bet is that this winter, it's gonna be cold in Moscow. I mean, in Kiev and wherever else, Zaporizhia, it's gonna be cold. And I would have my little heater and I would have I'd be running around with butane bottles, you know, and whatever else. I hate the cold. And, but I will bet you that the offensive isn't over. It's not, winter's not gonna end it. I will bet you that we're gonna see mass casualties. And remember, it was the mass casualties. Anybody seen Dr. Zhivago? God, I think I saw that on a date in 1967. Okay, you need to get it. You need Omar Sharif. He's Egyptian, you know. He's playing Dr. Zhivago with Russia. He said it was humiliating for him because he said, you know, all Egyptians have way too much hair. This is his fault. And his hair grew down to here. And so they had to shave his hair back like this so he'd look more Russian, okay, for the movie. But it's a classic, taken from Boris Pasternak. And one of the best things of all is coming down a road, you've got a column of soldiers pulling out of the line because they've been shot to pieces by the Germans and the Austrians. And they're slaughtering down, and here comes these two crack regiments with the general at the lead, and they're marching looking good and good order and everything else coming down the road. And when they mix up, they can't pass each other, they run into each other. The guys coming out with their wagon after wagon of wounded and everything else go running up to the new guys and say, don't do it. Don't do it. They'll slaughter you. They're just going to take you up there and slaughter you. And when the Tsarist officers tried to prevent them from bugging out, they just killed them all. Those are the guys that overthrew the Russian government. Okay. Because you can't just keep sending people out there under equipped and everything else and having them be slaughtered for no comprehensible reason. This is not Russia being invaded. There's no comprehensible reason other than a handful of people at the top's egos. And so this is where the real danger is for the Russians. It's possible it all bogs down again. But the Ukrainians have done a heck of a job. They're at about 700,000 or 800,000 now mobilized. And stop and think about this. Russia has all these men. This is from Perun when you look at mobilization, but you need to think about this. They have to man ships. They have to man submarines. They have to maintain nuclear systems, man missiles, keep internal security. They have to do all of this stuff that they're doing. The Ukes don't have any of that. You know why? Yeah, that old satellite is just hanging out there over the Ukraine and over the front lines, snapping pictures and picking up ELINT. And we're just looking at it and say, oh, I think they could use that. And there's a direct line the way we're helping. We have really, really been enormously smart in the way we've done intel since the war started. And the kind of strategically understanding what was going to happen before. And I say that because that's really hard to do. It's really hard to, nobody could figure out that the Russians were as incompetent and their stuff was, and the corruption had so badly. But we have really been good at that. And the reason is, if you get the old intel type, okay, and I'll talk, I mean, the guys that trained me, they won't tell you anything. Oh, no, we can't tell you about this. And so, I mean, the guy could be at your front door and they go, oh, but if we do, they might figure out that we got a guy hiding in the garbage can in the front yard, you know what I mean? And they can't do that, sources and methods. And so they don't tell you anything. Burns is a State Department guy, okay? And they said, this is bull. You have this intel. You don't give away everything, et cetera, but intel is there to use. And we're using it. And it's been very, very effective. So, yeah.
So would you expect a kind of return to the Cold War mentality with the looming threat of nuclear weapons, like you're running nuclear threats in school buildings where you're hiding under your desk or you're doing air raid siren practices?
You know, I think we've always been there. You know what I'm saying? I think it was an illusion that we had somehow left the Cold War. Russia really wasn't defeated. It fell apart. Russia fell apart in 1990. It wasn't really defeated. So it went broke. It went broke. And so there was never this realization. There was always this creed that says, oh, I wish we had the old Soviet Union. And these people still venerating Stalin, for God's sake. He only killed 20 million. I mean, you know, I mean, so I think that it never really went away. And I think that the Cold War was a whole lot better than the hot war we got going on right now. Yeah, we fought on the periphery and we made terrible mistakes. Vietnam, who's our biggest ally in Southeast Asia now? Vietnam. Who hates the Chinese more than us? Vietnam. You know, you go, I mean, we just weren't thinking these things through because we were mesmerized by the facade of an ideology that they call communism. We're going, well, we're not communists, you know? And so, yeah. So, yeah,
It's just since you brought it up, I'm curious,
I'm sorry.
just since you brought it up in the response to another question, I'm curious on your thoughts on the corn plant that was going up by Northrop. That the
Oh, the
Chinese-
corn plant?
Yep. Do you think that's in a strategy for intel, or do you think that's just a coincidence?
Well, I'll tell you this. If I were Chinese and dealing with the corn plant, okay, I'd be trying to figure out a way to do it. I don't know whether that's actually the purpose or what but I do believe that we got to quit being short-sighted. We got to quit holding classes at the University of Maryland, training Chinese diplomats and intelligence officers on how to do intelligence fusion and write national intelligence estimates. Because that's what we're doing. And it's because the Chinese hand out money to the universities. Universities are terrible. If you hand them money, they'll almost do anything. I mean, you know, seriously. Think about it. No, think about it. Think about it. You know, everything, you know, so, but you can't expect people in an academic environment that's sort of happy-go-lucky la-la land, okay, to really look at this and say, they're offering me $5 million to do this. Or some, I don't know, for all we know, for all we know that the guy was instead of a German Russian, he was a Russian German or something, you know, and he's got the family farm and it's so hard to farm and everything's incredible. He's got 39,000 kids. Okay, so how are you going to split that up and preserve, you know, I mean, it's a bunch of personal problems. And then you've got Uzi from some Chinese company comes along and says, well, we'll buy all of this from. Well, it would have been all right if it had all been out at Devil's Lake or something, but it's right next to the drone people. Okay? And so all I'm saying is they bought it, then we ought to just make sure there's nothing there that's problematic. And so maybe they'll decide that selling it was a good idea. You know what I mean? Because if I were running an operation, if they said, okay, we want to know about drones, now we're Chinese, I'd look at that and say, well, let's see, what can we put in a corn dryer that might not be obvious to all the people? I mean, what can we learn from this? I'd seriously be looking. And I don't think a Chinese company is going to be able to, gong on, they're not going to be able to say, no, we're not going to do that. That's a good way to go, you know, get deep six, you know, in Hong Kong Harbor. So anyway, I think, I don't know. The answer is I don't know. There's a lot of land for sale. I don't know why they decided that was an opportunity piece of land. And it may be totally an accident, but we ought to make sure that no matter what it is, it doesn't bite us. Okay, yeah.
You talked about like existential versus strategic threats. Could you like elaborate on how you make that distinction and how that like changes how to respond?
You mean, regional threat becoming strategic threat?
Yeah.
Okay, well, Iraq's a good example. It was a regional threat. Iraq was always a problem. But once they took Kuwait, if you don't do something, they've intimidated the whole Gulf. And they were headed for Saudi Arabia because the main oil fields were just about 120 miles away. And so you couldn't let that happen. So suddenly a regional threat morphed into a strategic threat. ISIS is an example. Okay, we came up with a brilliant idea to put the Shia in charge in Iraq. Now, the Bush administration gets full credit for that and that idiot Bramer that they sent to be vice president. Look it up. Okay, nobody could believe it. CIA, military, nobody could. All right. And then Obama comes along and he wants to get out. Well, heck, everybody wanted to get out after the meth. Okay, but Obama comes along and he thinks, okay, they're not going to ratify the status of forces agreement. Well, really, we just should have told them to lump it, that we're staying and here's what we're going to do. And oh, by the way, you're not trying the colonel, you're in a freaking Iraqi court. FYI, we don't care what he does. Okay. If it's a problem, we'll deal with it, but whatever, right? But Obama sees a legal way. Oh, well, we can't stay if they won't ratify this, and it gives us an out. Okay, in diplomatic, whatever, we don't have to listen to a bunch of people whining about it. And so we get out. Well, ISIS emerges, and I've got a whole lecture on that. I really am an expert on that. And but I've got a whole lecture on that whole ISIS thing. ISIS emerges, and because it forms a state, the Sunnis hated the Alawites that ruled in Syria. They hated the Shia in Iraq. They hated, everyone. And so if ISIS had been smarter, they could have really caused some problems. But luckily they were extremists and dumb. Okay, but still, you have this big state. Well, if that thing were to emerge into Saudi Arabia and hook up with with this handball-y ideology that they have there, Wahhabism, what we call Wahhabism, then you could have had the same problem that you had with Saddam. But it never got to that because we put the kibosh. Okay? And we did it in really limited fashion, very low cost and everything else, which is the way we should have been running things. And so North Korea. Well, North Korea is an irritant until one of its missiles goes haywire and lands in downtown Tokyo. Okay? Then we got a problem. Okay? Or it really does nuke somebody, or it comes across the 38 parallel. Then all of a sudden you're upsetting the strategic balance in East Asia, and we have to do something about it. Okay? So it's a matter of prioritizing. But what the Chinese are attempting and what the Russians are attempting, the question is, we're going to put Russia in this thing. They got 7,000 nukes, right? But if you're in a situation where we can demonstrate that nukes don't do you any good, we still have to be prepared to blow them off the face of the earth if we have to. And by the way, their technology is so bad, who knows how many of them will land in the right place or even go off, okay? Enough, enough. So it's not a static assessment. It keeps moving and you keep moving through it. Problem is that when we're talking about the public, okay, you have to sell the public on something. You get the public and they sound bites, okay? So they got this thought and it's stuck in their head and it's from 1965, okay? Communism bad, or something like this. And so somehow the educational process has kind of fallen down and we need to think, you need to be more. I mean, we actually have people on TV that think this is a bad idea of supporting the Ukrainians. We had a president that thought that was a bad idea, okay? And so forget about, nobody more conservative. But you gotta have a brain, for God's sake. okay? You gotta have a brain. And so you can't let mindless people drive this because it's whatever the last idea they heard. That's what floats around in the head. So you have to constantly be saying, here's where it is. And people will say, well, I just want to know what I'm supposed to believe, like it's somehow locked in stone. Well, that's something for your priest to tell you. When it comes to diplomacy and politics and strategic interest, the things are moving target. And so you need, but we have two steadfast things. The Russians have too many nukes for us to ignore. Okay? And actually, Putin was being extremely aggressive. I think Hill was right. He declared war on us in 2000. We just were trying to ignore it. And that is, I'm talking about Bush, Obama, and Trump. Okay? All of them in their own way were idiotic when it came to dealing with Russia. Some more so than others. Okay? And so you've got these people. You have to be able to tell the public, look, this is a moving thing, but you've got some setbacks. Russia, 7,000 acres. China wants to be the global power. It's Chinese. They can't help themselves. It's the Qing. They cannot help themselves. Whether it's realistic, whether they're going to fall apart, no matter what else, they can't help themselves. And here we are. Nice heated thing, lots of electronic. Go down the street, have food whenever we want to. Gas in our cars, a little expensive. Warms, more or less warm. Homes, et cetera, et cetera. And we're burning 25% of the world's resources. Right? What do you want to do? All right. I don't want to give up anything. But we're going to have to be smart to keep it. And the population needs to be a whole hell of a lot smarter than it is right now. So tomorrow, I can't tell you which regional threat is going to be done. Yeah.
On that note of world resources, so of course, Russia is rich with strategic resources, and that's all coming offline. Europe was depending a lot on that. Ukraine was producing a lot of food, obviously a little harder to do right now when you're busy fighting Russians. What does all these strategic resources coming offline do in the short term to Europe and the US?
Well, here's the thing. And you're talking about the guy that told the Germans 12, 15 years ago that you're idiots for getting dependent on the Russian, because sooner or later he's going to use it to blackmail. Okay. Can't help himself. Not that he's particularly evil, he just can't help himself. Psychotic. Everything comes offline. I've done 5 interviews, Al Jazeera, Middle East Broadcast Network, all of them have been on oil and whatever else. And the Germans have been in there whining about we ought to be doing more. And I said, what exactly should we do that's more? We're going to support you guys. We released 10 million barrels of oil.
Reachable
online.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll give you.
Give him a card.
Yeah,
I'll
my
give you a
apologies. I looked, it actually came out of you. Well, that's very interesting. My apologies.
No, that's good.
Yeah. Definitely like to reach out. It's for-
Would you mind?
Yeah, you won't mind. Just make sure. Thank you.
Okay. So all that stuff is coming along. We're putting it in. I said, so we're doing that. It's a global market. All that shale oil, Northern Europe sitting on them won't do because the Greens and they might have an earthquake. They might this. That's right. I hate that. I mean, I think it's an environmental crazy thing, but we have to do it because of what we are until we come up with an alternative. Okay. And so you get to sit on all that and whine about us charging you too much for oil. It's a global market. Exxon doesn't care. If they can get $9 a barrel, $9 million a barrel, they're gonna do it. So the point is that we're gonna have another dislocation. Now, I'm not too terribly sympathetic, I'll tell you why. Like I said, I'm old. I remember paying 19 cents a gallon for gas. Okay, and then I remember having a wife and a small baby and a graduate school stipend and waking up one morning after the oil embargo and paying $1.50 a gallon for gas. So I'm not too freaking sympathetic to all these whiners. I mean, if I can somehow pull through all of this and do it, all these people whine about, when I'm 20%. Oh, well, that's an inflation 8%. I remember getting a loan for my first house and I got a 12.5% loan to buy the house and thought it was a good deal. I mean, people, you lay your bed, you make your bed and you have to lie in it. We're helping the Europeans. This is what I'm told. But the real issue is we need to get together and have a Western energy policy, not just a US energy policy, a Western energy policy. And the other people that are idiots are the ones in Congress that say, let's don't export any of our oil and gas to anybody. Like that's going to help things here. It's not. Exxon is going to charge you whatever the global rate is. That's just nonsense. And you need to have the flexibility to make decisions, help your friends and help yourself. When you help your friends, you help yourself. Now, do I think we need to drive harder bargain? Yeah. I think we should have taken Mrs. Miracle, although I really like her kind of, and we should have grabbed her by her hair and banged her face into the table in the conference table about 2 or 3 times as she kept pushing this Putin policy. And I think now they've disappeared into the woodwork. She says, well, I think it was right then. I said, well, really? I said, well, it's not now. He's shown that you can't. I mean, really, you know what Churchill said about the Germans? They're either at your feet or at your throat. Okay? Well, frankly, I like the Germans that are kind of at your throat as opposed to the ones that are and remember, I was a student in Germany. I know, not the bad old Nazi ones, but the bad old Cold War ones. Yeah. So we're just going to have a little period here of dislocation and trying to get our arms around it and everything else. And in the long run, and I think, and here's the thing, the Saudis and all of this stuff, you know, Biden thought he was doing the right thing. I know the idiots that told him there to go to Saudi Arabia and make nice with Mohammed bin Salman. Mohammed bin Salman is a spoiled brat with a screw loose. Okay, you can't help it. You cannot help it. And we will need to teach them a lesson also. Okay, they've got a big problem. They have bitten off way more than they can chew in Yemen. And the Yemenis have a revanchist position on both Asir and Majran, and we have been critical to Saudi security. And somebody needs to remind them. Okay. Yeah, anybody else? Yeah.
As the war progresses and if Ukraine keeps winning, do you think they will potentially push past their past border and keep going into Russia? You think they'll stop?
No, I don't think we we'll cut the spigot off on them. And I don't really think they want to. They're gonna have their hands full just trying to reclaim what it's not clear to me they're gonna be able to reclaim everything. But maybe. I mean, the Russian army, there was an old Croatian general that I remember from back in the days of the wars in the Balkans, okay, in the 90s. And everybody thought the Serbs were going to take over everything because they had Russian backing, they were winning. And he was saying, you know, you never know about these things. Everybody thought they were going to win. And here, suddenly, almost like hitting a switch. We and the Bosnians just started wiping the floor with them. And they ended up losing everything they had and being pushed back into their areas, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't know you don't really know how that's gonna, I can't see them going beyond that. Now, I'll tell you this, they're already hitting stuff inside Russia. At Belgorod, Russians have these supply dumps, and so they're not gonna let the Russians hit Belgorod and show them from Belgorod. And that's another reason Russians don't want us getting involved, just conventionally. All these jets coming up and firing cruise missiles and everything else, we've got stuff that'll reach out and get them. And so the Russians could end up with more egg on them. And so I think we'll be able to tell a whole lot more come spring. Because I told several people that when Zelensky was saying, Curzon, retake the South. I've told numerous people, hey, you wouldn't be telegraphing this, they're up to something else. Okay? Launch the Curzon offensive that doesn't seem to work, and then all of a sudden, boom, the whole northwest Kiev province and everything else. The Ukes have been unbelievably creative and capable. Their old MiG-29s are now firing the latest anti-radar missile, is it AMRAAM 88? Harm missiles, with the whole package totally integrated into it. Now, part the Ukes and part US contractors that did it. But this is something everybody said was impossible. Apparently it's not. You ask a Russian air defense radar operator, what happens when he flips this switch on and the thing goes, and the next thing he knows, it locks, and then it hits the GPS coordinates. So even if you turn it off, guess what? You're still gonna be sitting there with that 85-pound missile coming right in your window. Okay, and so, I mean, it's unbelievable how creative that is. It's unbelievable. So I think we'll know a lot more in the spring. It could bog down into another stalemate. It just depends on how many casualties. But it also, the slaughter on the Russian side could get to the point that politically it just becomes untenable. Especially when you stop killing people from Chechnya and from the Caucasus. This is pure Russian racism. And you start killing white Russians from Moscow and Petersburg. Pure racism, the way the Russians are running. In all my years of dealing with the Russians overseas, the biggest single advantage you have is 99 out of 100 Russians who were trying this third world thing were stone cold racists. The only ones that weren't tended to be among the minority. Stone cold racist. And it's because of those things I pointed out, this idea of specialness to explain inferiority. They can't admit that the Ukrainians were better than they were or could fight. Even Putin said he made a mistake. Okay. All right, guys. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah, you got a question?
Could United States do something like what we did with Japan when Japan surrendered? We sent our own leaders or diplomats over there and helped set government back up.
No, what government?
The Japanese after World War II. Could we do something?
Well,
like
that's a little bit different. That was a little bit different situation. We helped them to do the right thing. Because if we let them do what they would have normally done, nothing would have changed. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So there was a select group of people that we needed to shoot and another group of people that we needed to hang. And then my old advisor in Germany, his father was anti-Hitler. He just wouldn't swear allegiance to him. So he was retired from the military. My advisor had absolutely fluent French. They wanted him to go into the SD, which is SF, the Sicherheitsdienst, the security service, the SF, when he was in France. He talked to a friend of his father who got him transferred to the Africa Corps. And he was captured by the Americans. They sent him back. And an American came up to him, he'd been there in prison for about 6 months, an American, captain showed up with three black NCOs armed with Thompson submachine guns and said, Bruins, you got 10 minutes. These guys are going with you. You can say goodbye and you gotta leave. And he says, why? And I said, we'll tell you later. And so he said his goodbye, packed his stuff up to leave, left. And they said there was a plot inside by hardcore Nazis. They had been assassinating POWs in their own group that were anti-Hitler. Okay? Bruins was sent to a special camp run by a general. He had his coffee every morning. He had his New York Times. He was given a job. He did all of this other stuff. He was well educated. And they put all these guys together, and as soon as the war was over, they shipped them back to Germany on the first boat back to Germany. And all of these former Nazis and everything else, we held them for a year or two. And so by the time they showed up, guess who was running the German government? Under American supervision. We were smart. He looked at me and he said, oh, the Americans. This is one night in Tunisia when I was based there. He said, you know, he kind of looks at me and he says, they have spies all over the place. And he said, and sometimes they're very smart. And that's what he was talking about. So there's your answer. You couldn't have let the Japanese redo it because you couldn't have changed the society. And you could argue that the society didn't really change that much, but certainly the structure and the institutions. Same thing's true of the Germans. And so, yeah. That's not something that what the Russians will ever invite us in to do or have anybody, because it's that xenophobia. How many people do you think are so insecure and have such an inferiority complex that they hide it behind this thing of I'm something special? The rules don't apply to me, you know, you just don't understand, blah, 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 blah. It's that kind of. Does that help? Yeah. Okay. All right, guys.
Thank you.